Hey guys, tonight we wander into the dimly lit corridors of history where silk robes sweep over stone floors, jewels glitter under flickering candlelight, and kings and queens, those paragons of power and dignity, well, they sometimes die in ways that are frankly more slapstick than stately. You probably won't survive this without cringing at least 3 times. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not post your location and local time in the comments? Let's see who's sharing this gloriously awkward journey with us tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge carefully into a grand, bustling Parisian arena, year 1559. The crowd is alive with cheers and whispers, the clinking of goblets, and the rustling of heavy fabrics, creating a soundtrack to what promises to be a day of entertainment and glory. But you already know, glory is going to get tangled up in something much less glamorous. There in the center sits King Henry II of France, proud, radiant, and in what historians politely describe as a showy mood. His golden armor gleams under the summer sun, his elaborate feathered helmet more suited for a parade than the rough and tumble of a jousting tournament. You squint. It's hard not to. The man is practically glowing, surrounded by sycophants and nobles, all eager to tell him how magnificent he looks. And tonight, Henry is determined to make a statement. After all, what's the point of being king if you can't show off a little? But history, as you're about to see, has a habit of humbling even the most flamboyant of rulers. Henry insists on participating in the joust himself against the advice of pretty much everyone with a working brain. He dons his ceremonial armor, decorative, not practical, and mounts his horse with the kind of overconfidence only royalty can muster. Historians agree that the fateful opponent was the young, dashing Gabriel Comte de Montgomery, and what was supposed to be a friendly exhibition quickly turned into, well, let's just say it wouldn't win any awards for safety. The 2 men charge. Lances collide. But as the crowd erupts, something goes wrong. Henry's golden helmet, over-decorated and poorly secured, becomes his undoing. A splinter from Montgomery's shattered lance pierces through the visor, straight into Henry's eye. And you thought your last game of dodgeball was rough. The king topples dramatically from his horse. The crowd gasps. Some faint. Some cheer, thinking it's all part of the show. But no, this isn't a performance. This is history's equivalent of a wardrobe malfunction mixed with a facepalm moment. Henry survives. Briefly. Doctors swarm. Leechers apply their leeches. Surgeons apply their, well, let's call them experimental techniques. It's all very medieval and all very useless. Henry languishes for days, drifting in and out of agonizing consciousness as the royal court turns into a chaotic swirl of whispered blame and panicked physicians. Was it the armor's fault? Was it Montgomery's? Or was it, as some gossipy court ladies insisted, a sign from the heavens that Henry had angered fate? Historians still argue whether Henry's insistence on wearing that showy, ill-fitted helmet was pure vanity, or an attempt to outshine his younger, flashier knights, and the quirky detail that always makes this story stick. Legend has it that Henry's last coherent words were not about honor or bravery, but about how badly he wanted the pain to stop. In other words, history's equivalent of, "I really regret showing off today." You can't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for the man. Here was a king at the height of his power, reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to look cool while ignoring basic safety gear. And as you stroll quietly away from the now somber arena, you can't help but chuckle softly. Of course, because if there's one lesson here, it's that even kings aren't immune to the universe's sense of irony. And yes, we're just getting started. You shuffle on the sound of creaking leather boots echoing in your ears as you leave behind the splintered jousting field and step into a much colder, much hungrier place, the Royal Dining Hall of Sweden, 1771. The smell hits you first. Rich stews, roasted meats, butter-drenched vegetables, and a dessert table that would make even the most disciplined monk break their vows. You, however, can't help but smirk, because you already know what's coming. Seated at the head of this decadent banquet is King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. And tonight, well, tonight he is determined to indulge. Adolf is known by historians for many things, but his most infamous achievement, quite possibly dying from eating too much dessert. Yes, that's right. While peasants across Sweden struggled through bitter winters and political turmoil, their monarch was stuffing his face with lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, and his true weakness, semla. Semla, for the uninitiated, is a fluffy cardamom-spiced bun stuffed with almond paste and whipped cream. Delicious. Absolutely. Lethal well. You watch as King Adolf devours not one, not two, but reportedly 14 semla buns. Was it a royal challenge? A moment of gluttonous rebellion? Historians still argue whether the king's last meal was a true death by dessert, or a convenient legend meant to exaggerate his fondness for food. Some fringe tidbits even suggest his death was more complicated, brought on by years of overindulgence rather than one night of pastry-fueled bravado. But let's be honest. Death by pudding just sounds more tragically hilarious. You tiptoe through the candlelit hall, dodging drunken courtiers as the king leans back in his chair, cheeks flushed, belly stretched to proportions that would make a stuffed turkey blush. He declares rather proudly that he feels victorious. Minutes later, history records he complained of violent stomach pains. He died that same night, his death certificate sparing no dignity, listing indigestion as a contributing factor. There is something almost poetic, if not pitiful, about a king who ruled a divided nation, navigated fraught politics, and yet became known to history textbooks everywhere as the monarch who literally ate himself to death. But it also raises those awkward scholarly debates. Was Adolf a symbol of royal excess at its most cartoonish? Or was his story twisted posthumously to serve as a cautionary fable against overindulgence during a time of societal hardship? You snack on that thought figuratively. Of course, as you wander past the abandoned dessert table, the semla buns still look suspiciously inviting. You can't help but muse. Imagine dying in the same embarrassing way, but centuries later. Would you be known as the king who overdosed on pizza and soda? Or perhaps the queen who ate 27 avocados in one sitting? It just doesn't have the same tragic, romantic flair, does it? And yet, somehow, King Adolf's demise remains one of history's strangest royal exits, equal parts absurd and oddly human, because who among us hasn't gone back for that extra slice of cake, even when we knew we shouldn't? You drift away from the sticky banquet hall, now past crumpled napkins and toppled goblets, leaving behind the echoes of gluttony and regret. Your next stop on this awkward journey, a royal bathroom. Because yes, history, it turns out, gets even more undignified from here. But we'll cross that porcelain threshold together. You tiptoe away from the scene of dessert-fueled disaster, only to find yourself stepping carefully through the echoing, marble-clad corridors of Kensington Palace, 1760. The air here is still heavy with the scent of lavender oil, damp stone, and something less pleasant wafting from behind one particular ornate door. You can already feel it. Yes, You know where this is going. Inside sits King George II of Great Britain, and according to palace rumor and later chroniclers, he is indisposed. You glance awkwardly at the lavishly adorned royal toilet, a stately contraption of velvet gold leaf, and all the elegance you might expect from a monarch's private chamber. But let's not sugarcoat it. It's still a toilet. And poor King George II, in his final moments, is about to become history's most famous example of why you probably shouldn't take your reading material into the bathroom. The official record states that George II died of an aortic aneurysm, a rupture of the heart's largest artery, a known silent killer. But the part people remember, that he collapsed while seated, mid-morning, in the royal loo. And while scholars still argue whether he technically died right there or after being discovered on the floor, the visual is forever seared into history's memory. One quirky tidbit: contemporary accounts noted the king was particularly fond of starting his day with strong coffee, followed by, well, a lengthy stay on the porcelain throne. A routine many modern folks might find oddly relatable, but you can't help but smirk at the irony. Here was the man who fought the Jacobites, ruled over Britain's emerging empire, and presided over significant moments in British politics, only to be remembered as the king who, quite literally, had a bathroom blunder to end all bathroom blunders. And let's be honest, if you ever wanted proof that kings are at the end of the day just like the rest of us, this is it. Historians, of course, debate the dignity or lack thereof of such stories. Was George VI's death on the toilet exaggerated by his political enemies to mock the crown? Was it a convenient way for satirists to poke fun at an already unpopular monarch? The debates continue quietly, and perhaps uncomfortably. But what makes this even more fascinating is the cultural fallout. Pamphlets, cartoons, and songs spread quickly throughout London, delighting the masses with the king's less than glamorous departure. Some called it fitting karma. Others whispered that even in death, the king couldn't escape public scrutiny. And you shuffle carefully back down the palace hallways, nose wrinkling slightly as you pass a footman who surely has some unfortunate cleanup duties tonight. And maybe, just maybe, you muse. The moral here is simple. Even the mightiest fall, sometimes quite literally. And as the candlelight flickers, you glance nervously at your own bathroom door, because if George II could meet his end in such an undignified manner, well, maybe today's not the day to read War and Peace while seated. But you shake off the thought. There are more awkward royal deaths ahead, and they get weirder and wetter Because next, you're about to witness a hunting accident that's less majestic stag and more slapstick slap to history's face. You shuffle onward, away from royal restrooms and awkward rumors, only to find yourself stepping into the damp, pine-scented forests outside Constantinople, year 886. The scent of fresh pine needles underfoot mingles with the musk of horses and hunting hounds. You breathe in and nearly sneeze as a plume of royal perfume wafts past. Ahead rides Emperor Basilfuer of the Byzantine Empire, grand, fearsome, and in his own mind at least immortal. But tonight, dear listener, even empires must face banana peel moments. Basil I is out hunting a pastime that allowed rulers to flex their military prowess and show off their horsemanship. But tonight's outing is about to take a turn from heroic to horribly awkward. The mainstream historical account goes like this: Basil, while on horseback, attempts to show off his skill by chasing down stag. The creature, however, leads him on a chaotic chase through dense underbrush, thick brambles, and most unfortunately, into a hidden ditch. It's the kind of thing that would make a Roman historian put down his stylus and just facepalm. But there's a fringe tidbit whispered in some accounts that it wasn't the stag's cunning that doomed Basil. It was his own horse. You see, Basil had a favorite steed, a rather temperamental beast, with a habit of suddenly bucking when it got annoyed. And tonight, as luck or karma would have it, the horse decided it had enough of the emperor's bravado. One lurch, one stumble, and Basil found himself thrown directly into the stag's antlers. Yes, you heard that right. A noble emperor of Byzantium, brought down not by an army, not by poison, not even by his scheming enemies, but by gravity, hubris, and a pointy stag. Historians still argue whether the antlers were the immediate cause of death, or if Basil survived long enough to be dragged by his panicked horse, suffering injuries that led to a slower demise. But regardless, the visuals are, well, not exactly the majestic death scene you might expect from the ruler of one of the world's greatest empires. You stand awkwardly at the edge of the hunting party, watching nobles rush forward, torn between gasps of horror and awkward attempts to pretend this was dignified. Spoiler, it wasn't. The emperor's bloodied, rumpled body was eventually retrieved, the official record carefully smoothed over to sound a bit more, shall we say, imperial. But the whispers in the streets told the real story, and it didn't exactly make for a flattering ballad. In fact, Basil's enemies gleefully spread tales of the emperor's final moments, painting him as a man who died chasing animals, like a drunken fool, rather than a warrior or a scholar. And you can't help but smile softly, of course, at how even the great Basil, builder of churches, conqueror of lands, ended up as the punchline of a hunting mishap. It also raises, once again, those endlessly debated scholarly questions. Was Basil's death truly an accident? Or did someone nudge the horse? Did the stag's antlers really deliver the fatal blow? Or did palace politics do the work later offstage? Historians will likely keep arguing these points forever. But you quietly chalk it up as yet another case of history, proving that no matter how grand the crown, the universe has a way of slipping banana peels, sometimes in the shape of antlers, right under your feet. And as you stroll through the misty forest, the stag long gone, the hunting party disbanding into awkward silence, you wonder, what could possibly top that? Well, prepare yourself, because your next royal death involves a king, a horse, and an entire night of really bad decision-making. You trudge through the Scottish Highlands, now the wind biting the fog, swirling like ghosts around the flickering torches lining a royal path. It is 1286, and you are here to witness the final unfortunate journey of King Alexander III of Scotland. A king, mind you, who had managed to secure relative peace in his realm, expand his territories, and by medieval standards, keep his kingdom fairly intact. But as you know by now, history has a way of sneaking in those awkward final chapters. Alexander's night begins, as so many do in these tales, with wine bravado and a bit of royal stubbornness. It's his queen's birthday, and despite the late hour, the howling storm, and his advisors' increasingly nervous glances, Alexander insists on riding across treacherous terrain to be by her side. A romantic gesture. Maybe. A reckless one. Absolutely. You watch as he mounts his horse, ignoring the howling winds, and the fact that the path ahead winds dangerously close to sea cliffs. His guards plead with him to wait until morning. He laughs because, well, what's the point of being king if you can't ignore sensible advice? Now and then, mainstream historians agree that Alexander set off into the storm alone, cloak whipping in the wind, determined to reach his queen's side before the night was over. And predictably, he never made it. The king was found the next morning, his body sprawled at the base of a cliff neck, broken still clutching the reins of his startled horse, an undignified end for a man who had spent his reign trying to make Scotland less chaotic. But of course, scholars still argue whether it was truly an accident. Some whisper that his death was suspiciously convenient for certain ambitious nobles. Others point to the treacherous terrain and say, "Well, what did you expect when you mix royal arrogance with medieval road conditions?" One quirky detail that tickles you as you stand in the rain-soaked grass. Some chroniclers noted that Alexander's horse was fine. The king, less so. In other words, the animal he trusted more than his advisors survived without a scratch, while the king became yet another example of royal overconfidence meeting a literal cliffhanger. You pause, letting the scene sink in. The cold wind biting your cheeks, the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocks below the lonely silhouette of the king's abandoned castle, barely visible in the mist. It's the kind of moment that reminds you of a basic rule of history. When kings make emotional decisions in the dark, things rarely end well. And yet, Alexander's death sent shockwaves across Scotland, sparking political instability, succession crises, and the eventual wars for independence. A small misstep with colossal consequences. You shiver, not just from the damp, but from the knowledge that sometimes history turns not on grand battles or epic speeches, but on stubborn men making bad choices in bad weather. And as you trudge onward through the wet highland paths, you wonder quietly, could it get more awkward than dying alone on a cliff for a birthday party? Oh, it can. Because your next stop takes you back to ancient Rome, where an emperor learns the hard way that power doesn't make you indestructible. You shuffle through a haze of incense and distant political scheming, arriving now in the grand crumbling empire of Rome. It's the 3rd century, and the man of the hour, or perhaps the man of the awkward exit, is Emperor Valerian. You peer cautiously through the marble pillars of the imperial court, where statues loom and advisors whisper. Valerian, by all accounts, is having a rough day, or rather a rough decade. His reign has been, well, less than stellar. Faced with plagues, rebellions, and an empire fraying at the edges, Valerian decides to take matters into his own hands, or more specifically, into his army's hands. He marches east to face the Persian king Shapur I. And it's here that things get messy. Embarrassingly messy. Mainstream historians agree that in 260 AD, Valerian's forces were crushed by Shapur's Persian army. But the real kicker, Valerian himself, was captured. And this is where the story takes a turn from humiliating to almost cartoonishly cruel. Accounts, some reliable, some perhaps exaggerated by gleeful enemies, tell of Valerian being kept as a human footstool for Shapur. Yes, you heard that right. Rome's emperor, reduced to kneeling under Shapur's feet whenever the Persian king mounted his horse. A quirky tidbit. Some ancient sources suggest the Persians even paraded him around as a living trophy, a walking, breathing example of Roman defeat. And while historians still argue whether these tales were embellished for political propaganda, the fact remains: Valerian is the only Roman emperor to have ever been captured alive in such a public, humiliating way. But wait, it gets worse. There are, let's say, creative descriptions of his final fate. Some suggest he was executed and his body stuffed and displayed as a grim reminder to future Roman diplomats not to get cocky. Others debate if he died quietly in captivity. His dignity, long eroded, his legacy turned to cautionary tales. You stand there awed and just a little uncomfortable as you imagine the scene. A man who once ruled over millions, now reduced to a footrest. It's the kind of historical irony that makes you both cringe and chuckle, softly, of course, because the universe does love to humble even the mightiest. And it raises yet another scholarly debate. Was Valerian's capture purely the result of military overconfidence, or a sign of an empire so crumbling from within that even its leaders could no longer see the cracks beneath their feet? Regardless, Valerian's story endures as one of the most awkward, undignified imperial exits ever recorded. And as you wander through the ruins of his former empire, you can't help but glance at your own feet. Because if history teaches anything, it's that even emperors can end up under someone's boots. But dry your feet, traveler. You have more awkward exits to witness. Next up, a little emperor with a big ego, and a final portrait that was almost as embarrassing as his military blunders. You stroll onward the dusty Roman roads, giving way to the salty breezes of St. Helena, an island so remote, so isolated, you wonder if even awkward history can find its way here. But it does, because tonight you find yourself in the presence of none other than Napoleon Bonaparte, the man, the myth, the rather moody exile. By the time you arrive, Napoleon is no longer the fiery general of old. He's grumpier, balder, and if the servants' gossip is to be believed, more obsessed with staging elaborate self-portraits than conquering nations. You tiptoe through his gloomy estate, past bored guards and irritable cooks, until you find him in his favorite spot, brooding dramatically by the window, wrapped in an overly grand robe, gazing wistfully at nothing. Mainstream historians agree that Napoleon's death in 1821 was due to stomach cancer, worsened by poor treatment and general bitterness. But of course, history wouldn't let him exit quietly, because before his final curtain call, Napoleon insisted on commissioning paintings of himself. Lots of them. One particularly infamous portrait, finished just months before his death, shows him standing in a stiff, unnatural pose, hand awkwardly stuffed inside his coat, a gesture that has sparked endless jokes, memes, and of course, scholarly debates. Was he hiding stomach pain? Was it a secret symbol of Freemasonry? Or, as some fringe historians suggest, was he just trying to look regal while battling the world's worst case of indigestion? You can't help but chuckle softly as you peer at the painting. The man who once commanded armies now stood forever immortalized, looking like someone who just lost an argument with his tailor. And the quirkiest detail, Napoleon allegedly detested the portrait once it was finished, calling it stiff and unflattering. Yet, he still approved its public display. Because, well, what else could he do? History had already painted him into the corner. And his death. Well, let's just say it was as anticlimactic as his final portrait. Bedridden, surrounded by squabbling doctors and staff, Napoleon's last days were a swirl of stomach cramps, delusions of past glories, and the quiet erosion of a once towering ego. And yet, historians still argue over the real cause of death. Some suggest it was indeed cancer. Others whisper of slow arsenic poisoning by his enemies, or even his allies, depending on who's holding the pen. But no matter the cause, Napoleon's final exit from history's stage was not the blaze of glory he might have envisioned. Instead, it was a slow, awkward fade, surrounded by peeling wallpaper, bad portraits, and bitter regrets. You drift past his empty chair now, the salty breeze sneaking through the cracked windows, carrying the scent of damp paper and disappointment. And you can't help but think, for all his conquests, all his bravado, Napoleon ended up as just another man in exile, fussing over how he looked in his last photo. You smirk, because if there's a lesson here, it's that even emperors can't control their legacy once they're gone. And as you step back into the moonlight, you brace yourself. Your next stop takes you to Korea, where a royal rice chest becomes the most tragically awkward coffin in history. You step softly now into the royal courts of 18th century Korea, where the scent of incense floats thick in the air, blending with whispers of court intrigue and paranoia. The palace is eerily quiet tonight, and for good reason. You are about to witness one of the most unsettling and, yes, tragically awkward royal deaths in Korean history. Crown Prince Sado stands at the center of the storm. Once heir to the Joseon throne, now the subject of terrified glances and hushed rumors. By all accounts, Prince Sado was troubled, plagued by violent outbursts, erratic behavior, and a fascination with weapons that made even his loyal attendants uneasy. Mainstream historians agree his father, King Yongzhou, faced an impossible dilemma. Sado's behavior made him unfit to rule, but public execution of the crown prince unthinkable, at least not openly. And so, you watch as the court settles on a compromise that is both uniquely Korean and uniquely horrifying. Prince Sado is ordered into a large wooden rice chest. Yes, a rice chest. The kind used to store grain, now used to store, well, a prince. You can barely watch as the prince, confused and pleading, steps into the chest, the lid sealing shut with a dull thud. No blades, no poison, just time. It is said that the prince lingered there for days. Some accounts say 8, others less. Historians still argue the exact duration, and whether the decision was born purely from political desperation or a father's deeply personal torment. But the result remains the same. You tiptoe through the courtyard past the solemn-faced servants who can do nothing but listen as the cries from the rice chest grow weaker and weaker until they stop. And yet, even in death, the awkwardness doesn't end. The royal court is thrown into chaos. Whispers swirl like the autumn leaves around you. Was this an execution? Or was it, as some chroniclers delicately put it, a form of corrective confinement? You shake your head. Call it what you will. It was a royal death that left a kingdom rattled and a dynasty forever haunted. One quirky tidbit that might surprise you: Prince Sado's son, King Jongzhou, would later rise to the throne, carrying the shadow of his father's death into his reign, carefully maneuvering his court through an ocean of paranoia and grief. Some say Jongzhou spent his entire life trying to atone for the sins of his father, and perhaps the sins of the system that locked him away. And you can't help but reflect on the sheer absurdity of it all. A royal family, so trapped by its own rules, its own pride, its own fear of public embarrassment, that it chose to turn a grain chest into an execution chamber. It's the kind of death that makes even the worst family dinner look tame by comparison. And as you leave the silent palace, your feet crunching over fallen leaves, you can almost hear the echoes from that rice chest still rattling through the corridors of history. You sigh. Surely things can't get more awkward than that, right? Oh, but they can. Because next, you'll witness a queen who lost a fight with a chair. And yes, It's as embarrassing as it sounds. You shuffle now into the brightly lit corridors of St. James's Palace, London, early 1737. The air is stuffy with the cloying scent of perfumed oils, and the buzz of gossip is thick enough to spread on toast. Tonight, your attention is drawn to Queen Caroline of Ansbach, consort to King George II, and according to palace rumor, a woman known for her wit, iron will. And as fate would have it, an ill-fated encounter with a particularly rebellious piece of palace furniture. It starts innocently enough. Caroline, a woman of power and influence, begins experiencing severe abdominal pain. She assumes it's nothing serious. Perhaps the rich food, perhaps the stress of running a kingdom while her husband grumbles about politics and hunting trips. But what begins as discomfort quickly worsens. Doctors are summoned, of course. They poke, they prod. They recommend the usual 18th century remedies, bleeding, purging you, name it. But the pain remains. And here comes the part that has turned many a historical brow skyward in disbelief. According to some sources, Queen Caroline suffered from a strangulated umbilical hernia. But what you ask triggered it. Historians still argue about that. One fringe but persistent theory: a sharp edge from a low, ill-placed chair in her dressing room. Some accounts claim she injured herself while awkwardly attempting to sit down, perhaps while adjusting one of those mammoth corset-crushing gowns fashionable at the time. You wince at the thought. Yes, the queen who once held court over Europe's most powerful figures may have been undone by a splintering chair. But of course, the royal doctors wouldn't dare admit such an indignity outright. They layered it in medical jargon and 18th century politesse. But behind the silken curtains, the truth whispered through the palace like an unspoken joke. And yet, despite the embarrassment, Queen Caroline faced her final days with an almost stoic calm. Mainstream historians agree that she refused to allow doctors to sugarcoat the situation. She knew she was dying. She planned her own funeral. She even gave her husband a painfully awkward yet practical piece of advice: remarry if you must, but at least choose someone younger this time. That's the kind of historical sass you can't make up. But while Caroline's death was tragic and her suffering immense, the awkwardness of her demise lingered in the court's gossip for years. Because what could be more embarrassing than the Queen of England being taken out by an undignified furniture accident? Some say it was poetic irony. That the Queen who spent her life navigating the dangerous, uncomfortable chairs of power was finally bested by an actual chair. And you can't help but shake your head and chuckle softly. Of course, because if there's one thing history loves more than a grand coronation, it's a royal mishap that ends with someone falling. Literally. You leave the palace now, stepping carefully, watching your own chair placement just in case, and head toward your next royal misadventure. A tale of kings' lakes and a drowning that historians still can't quite decide if it was tragic or tragically ridiculous. You tread carefully now into the misty fairy tale landscapes of Bavaria, where castles perch on cliffs and legends float like mist over quiet lakes. It is 1886, and you are about to witness the mysterious, somewhat theatrical, and undeniably awkward end of King Ludwig II of Bavaria, known affectionately and sometimes mockingly as the fairy tale king. Ludwig II was famous for building lavish castles, embracing opera, and indulging in fantasies that would make Walt Disney look budget-conscious. But Ludwig's love of grandeur didn't end at architecture. He surrounded himself with excess pageantry and what his advisors might diplomatically call questionable decision-making. Mainstream historians agree Ludwig was declared insane. Whether fairly or not remains a hot scholarly debate and deposed. And what happens next? Well, it's pure Bavarian soap opera. On June 13th, Ludwig and his doctor, Dr. Bernhard von Guden, go for an evening stroll near Lake Starnberg. Neither returns. Hours later, their bodies are found floating in the shallow waters. No witnesses, no clear explanation. And thus begins one of the strangest chapters of royal death folklore. Was it suicide, as the official report hastily claimed? Or was it murder? Perhaps by those who wanted the king gone for good. Historians still argue fiercely and endlessly about the truth. But here's the kicker, the quirky, unsettling tidbit. Ludwig's body, when found, was floating upright, fully dressed, boots, polished cloak, dramatically fanned out behind him. Witnesses swore he looked theatrical, almost as if he intended his death to be a performance, one last defiant tableau against those who had stripped him of his throne. And to add to the oddity, his doctor's body showed clear signs of blunt force, trauma, suggesting that perhaps in his final moments, Ludwig wasn't as alone as the official version liked to pretend. You stand now at the edge of the dark, still waters the moon, reflecting off the glassy surface. It's easy to see why rumors still swirl like autumn leaves here. Some locals whisper they can still see the king's silhouette strolling the shores, murmuring to himself about castles that were never finished. And you can't help but feel the tragedy beneath the awkwardness. a king who wanted to escape reality so badly that his final act blurred the line between life-death and theatrical farce. And as you wander away from the lake, the faint strains of Wagner's operas drifting through your imagination, you wonder, was Ludwig a madman? Or just a man born in the wrong century? Scholars continue to debate it, and perhaps that's the real curtain call Ludwig would have wanted. But don't dry your boots yet, because your next royal misadventure takes you even further back into ancient Egypt, where a certain queen's legendary death may have been a little less Cleopatra and a little more slapstick. You step softly now into the sun-scorched corridors of ancient Alexandria, where myths shimmer like heat waves, and history slips easily into legend. It is 30 BC, and you are about to witness the final overly dramatized act of Cleopatra VII, Egypt's last pharaoh-famed seductress, political mastermind. And according to some rather eyebrow-raising theories, possibly the star of one of the clumsiest royal deaths ever whispered down the centuries. You watch as Cleopatra, facing the collapse of her empire, the suicide of Mark Antony, and the triumphant march of Octavian's Roman legions, makes the choice to take her own life. At least, that's the version everyone likes to tell. Mainstream historical accounts famously credit her death to an aspi, an Egyptian cobra, coiled artfully inside a basket of figs, ready to strike. It's a death fit for Shakespeare, for grand opera, for oil paintings, with lots of dramatic shadows. But historians still argue whether that's what actually happened. Some suggest the ASP was symbolic, not literal. Others argue it would have been logistically difficult and, frankly, quite awkward to smuggle a hissing, cranky snake into her private chamber without anyone noticing. And then there's the fringe, wonderfully weird theory that Cleopatra, in her final, desperate bid to control the narrative, may have used a poisoned hairpin, or as one particularly skeptical scholar once wrote, she likely employed a much less glamorous method, but let the poets have their snake. You can't help but smirk as you picture it. The great Cleopatra, last of the pharaohs, scrambling to find a venomous snake that may or may not have been willing to cooperate. Imagine the scene if the snake had refused to bite, or slithered off into a curtain, or bit the wrong person. You shake your head. One quirky tidbit that always makes you pause. Roman sources loved to emphasize the asp's dramatic, exotic imagery, but Egyptian sources were conspicuously silent on the matter. Perhaps to them, the details of Cleopatra's death were less important than the fact that the empire she ruled, the goddess queen image she had carefully crafted, all came crashing down in the end. Whether snake pin or less poetic concoction. Her death marked the final end of Egypt's ancient dynasties, and you can't help but wonder, did Cleopatra truly choose the asp? Or did Rome choose that story for her? Scholars continue to whisper their theories, never quite able to agree. But you walk away from the marble columns and blood-stained myths, feeling a bit of sympathy for the queen whose legendary life may have ended in a far less legendary, slightly slapstick stumble toward death. And you chuckle softly, because even queens, even those who ruled rivers and seas, cannot always script the perfect ending. Your next step, it leads you into a palace bedroom, where a king's flamboyant life ends in flaming sheets. Yes, really. You shuffle now into the elaborately perfumed court of Navarre, where rich tapestries drape the walls and the flicker of candles hides the cracks in royal facades. It is the late 1380s, and you're here to witness the rather smoldering and, yes, absurdly embarrassing demise of Charles II of Navarre, also known as Charles the Bad. And oh boy, he lives up to the nickname. Charles, you learn, was not a popular king. Known for treachery scheming and a general talent for making enemies, he navigated his rule through the murkiest of political waters. But it's his death, not his life, that earns him a place on your tour of awkward royal exits. Mainstream historical accounts agree that Charles, in his later years, suffered from severe illness. His doctors, desperate to save him, or at least make him smell slightly less like impending doom, wrapped him in linen sheets soaked in brandy, a folk remedy meant to stimulate the blood. So far, so medieval. But then comes the moment that turns a grim tale into, well, a black comedy. According to chroniclers of the time, an unfortunate servant tasked with cutting the sheets used a candle to see what he was doing. You wince, already guessing where this is going. The flame caught the alcohol-soaked linens, turning the King of Navarre into a literal human torch. The court scrambled. Servants screamed. But by the time the flames were extinguished, Charles the Bad was quite fittingly Charles the Very Badly Burnt. Some historians whisper that this story might have been embellished. After all, Charles had no shortage of enemies, eager to make his death as ridiculous as possible. Others maintain that while the details may be suspect, the core truth remains. Charles's final act was less royal decree, more accidental flambe. One particularly quirky tidbit. Even after his death, rumors spread that the devil himself came to collect Charles's soul, riding a black horse through the streets of Pamplona, because apparently the medieval public felt one final roasting wasn't enough. You stand awkwardly by the now scorched bed, the smell of charred linen clinging to the air, and you can't help but think, for a man who spent his life scheming in the shadows, it's almost poetic that he would exit the world in the most painfully public, fiery fashion imaginable. And as you walk cautiously away, checking your sleeves for stray sparks, you marvel at how history never lets even the most cunning monarchs escape a little slapstick. But you'd better keep your appetite in check, friend, because your next royal blunder happens at a feast where overindulgence meets a king's final faceplant into history's embarrassing banquet table. You step quietly now into a grand medieval dining hall, the smell of roasted meats, spiced wine, and far too much garlic mingling in the heavy air. It is 1305, and you've been invited, strictly as an observer, of course, to the royal banquet of King Wenceslaus III of Bohemia, a king known not for his leadership skills or military prowess, but for his appetite. And as you'll soon see, a rather embarrassing dining room disaster. The hall buzzes with laughter, clinking goblets, and the endless drone of minstrels hired to make the event feel fancier than it really is. But as you glance at Wenceslaus, you can't help but notice the man is indulging heavily. He sits slouched on his throne-like chair, goblet in one hand, gnawing enthusiastically on a roasted goose leg with the other. Mainstream historians record that Wenceslaus was assassinated that year, stabbed by unknown assailants in Olomouc. But fringe accounts and palace gossip, they love to point out what might have made him an easy target. One quirky theory whispered behind gloved hands that Wenceslaus, known for his excesses, died during or immediately following a particularly gluttonous feast. Some stories suggest that his overindulgence left him vulnerable, sluggish, and perhaps too full to react when his assassins crept upon him. Others lean toward the more poetic, if not entirely credible image of the king choking on his dinner, creating enough of a scene that his enemies simply took advantage of the chaos. Historians still argue whether his death was purely political or aided by his, let's call it, distracted state. But what everyone agrees on Wenceslaus's reign was short, his habits indulgent, and his end tinged with culinary embarrassment. You stand there, watching, as the king demands yet another round of honey cakes and ale, his advisors looking more nauseous than impressed. And you wonder, was his feast truly the cause of his undoing? Or was it merely a symbol of a king so bloated by power and privilege that he forgot the basics of, say, personal security? Either way, as you tiptoe past the banquet tables, groaning under the weight of meats, breads, and flagons, you can't help but smirk. It seems history has a soft spot for kings who go out not on the battlefield, but at the buffet table. And as the minstrels drone on, and the king drowns his ambitions in another goblet of clove-infused wine, you prepare yourself, because your next royal disaster takes you high, very high, where kings and windows rarely mix well, and gravity always wins. You climb now, carefully, your hands brushing against cold stone as you ascend the winding staircases of ancient castles and towering fortresses. And as you peer out through narrow arched windows, you might begin to suspect, rightfully, that many a royal met their awkward end by forgetting the laws of gravity. Tonight, you observe a pattern that repeats itself through history like a poorly timed pratfall. Kings and towers. Rarely a good combination. Mainstream historical accounts offer you several tragic examples. You start with King John of Bohemia, whose blindness didn't stop him from charging into battle, and according to some right over a castle parapet. Then there's the tragic case of King James II of Scotland. He loved cannons. He loved sieges. But as some quirky accounts record, he might have gotten a little too close to the action, resulting in an explosion that catapulted him into an ignoble pile of his own shattered ambitions. But perhaps the most awkward, that would be the lesser known, but undeniably cringeworthy tale of King Martin of Aragon. You crouch in the shadows of his royal chamber, where, according to whispered records, Martin suffered from severe indigestion. Yes, history seems to adore monarchs with gastrointestinal woes. But it wasn't the bellyache that did him in. It was boredom, legend has it. Martin, restless during a long evening of discomfort, demanded his court jester entertain him while he, perched precariously on the edge of his balcony. Historians still argue whether the following sequence of events was accidental or the jester's ill-timed joke. But what's recorded is this. Martin laughed. He leaned. He tipped. And like so many before him, the weight of royal robes, pride, and perhaps a little too much dinner sent him plummeting from the balcony into the castle courtyard below. Some versions say he died instantly. Others suggest he survived long enough to make one final grim joke of his own. The details are murky, but the message is clear. Kings and high places. Not a winning combo. And you can't help but feel the universe's cosmic smirk. Because for all their power, for all their advisors and astrologers and generals, kings still forgot the simplest rule of nature. What goes up must come down. And when they did, well, they rarely did it gracefully. You leave the dizzy heights behind now, carefully minding each step. Because, let's face it, history's taught you by now that even a slipper can have it out for royalty. And as you descend into the quieter corners of your journey, you prepare yourself, because your final collection of royal endings, they're not fiery, not messy, but perhaps the most quietly absurd of them all. You walk now into the forgotten footnotes of royal history, the quiet, absurd, and almost gentle exits that never quite make the epic paintings or soaring ballads. These are the deaths of kings and queens who didn't go down in a blaze of glory, but more like a soft, awkward stumble into obscurity. Take King Louis III of France, for example. A young, brash ruler with ambitions bigger than his kingdom. But it wasn't an assassin or a battlefield that ended his reign. No, Louis met his end by chasing a girl. You sigh, already knowing this can't end well. According to contemporary accounts, Louis was so taken with a young woman that he mounted his horse in a frenzy of romantic determination, and failing to see the low lintel of a doorway, rode headfirst into the frame. And that was that. Historians still argue whether it was truly an accident, or if perhaps the story was romanticized by later chroniclers looking for a quirky tale. Either way, Louis III's rule ended not with the stroke of a sword, but the thud of a forehead. Then there's King William the Silent of the Netherlands. The irony. His nickname, the Silent, was perhaps more famous than the man himself. And his death. A quiet footnote in a hallway ambush where an assassin shot him at point-blank range. Quick. Efficient. Almost too quiet for a man of his stature. And then there are those whose deaths weren't violent, or dramatic, or even particularly memorable, like Queen Anne of Great Britain, who simply faded from life after years of illness, her body swollen from dropsy, her mind clouded by sorrow and loss. No glorious speeches, no violent overthrows, just slipping away, alone, as courtiers politely pretended she still mattered, and that you realize is perhaps the most quietly awkward royal death of all. To be so grand, so powerful, only to fade like a forgotten candle in a room no longer watching. You pause, letting the weight of these quieter endings settle into your bones. Because sometimes history reminds us that even kings and queens sometimes just drift away. No drama, no explosions, just a sleepy goodbye. And as you prepare to leave this long, winding journey of embarrassing royal deaths, you glance back over the parade of fallen crowns, broken thrones, and toppled egos. It's been a strange walk, hasn't it? From jousts gone wrong to pudding-fueled catastrophes, to kings tripping over their own capes. And yet, in each, there's a gentle reminder that no matter how high we rise, how much power we hold, we all exit the same stage, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes quietly, always inevitably. And now, as the echoes of clumsy footsteps, splintering chairs, and misjudged towers fade softly into the shadows of your mind, you feel the stillness of the room settle around you like a velvet cloak. The parade of kings and queens, so loud, so proud, has faded into gentle whispers. You feel the hum of the night, the slow rhythm of your own breath, the world outside quiet, still, almost timeless. You let the images of golden thrones, flickering torches, and awkward royal missteps drift further into the distance. Their tales, once sharp and colorful, now softened by the gentle fog of sleep. And as your eyes grow heavier, you smile just a little. Because even in these stories of power and pride, there is comfort. Comfort in knowing that history is filled not just with grand heroes, but with wonderfully awkward, deeply human moments. And perhaps it's those quiet, silly missteps that remind us most of our shared fragility. You allow yourself to relax now, your body sinking deeper into the mattress, your breath slowing, drifting on the soft winds of history's forgotten lullabies. The journey is over. The candles are out. The kings and queens have taken their final bows. And you're exactly where you need to be. Safe, warm, surrounded by the quiet hush of stories long told, sweet dreams